From time to time, people start telling some pretty incredible stories. For instance, they'll tell you about how they suddenly found themselves in a world similar to the one we're used to, but with some pretty big differences. Or on the other hand, this world is completely different from ours and nothing like the one we know. People who live in parallel worlds, if they are human at all, tend to shock the wanderer. I've spent some time on the internet and forums reading about real people who have traveled to parallel worlds. So today we're going to look at a few real stories about people who have had some pretty unusual experiences. The first story was written by a woman. I once had a chance to see something like a portal to another dimension. I don't know what it was, but at that moment I was not alone, but with my husband. He and I went to the woods for mushrooms. We first picked mushrooms in one section of the forest, then we went to the next. And when we got to that section, my husband and I were speechless. The birch trees were huge, and the forest was filled with a heavenly blue light. There was some beautiful shimmering in the distance. I was so enthralled that if I had been alone at that moment, I would have just gone there. I'm glad my husband was there. He's never believed in anything paranormal, but here he just numbed and took me by the sleeve and said that we should leave as soon as possible. From there, my husband spent the whole way back in silence. One theory is that the woman and her husband fell into a time gap and found themselves in the past. This theory is similar to another well-known theory. The theory suggests that even 1,000 years ago, there were some truly enormous trees and a lot more forest than we see today. The second story. Once again, the story was written by a woman. The story I'm about to tell you happened in 1975, near the city of Erfurt in Germany. A friend of my aunt was walking to a farm along a field and suddenly stumbled over something. When she looked up, she saw herself on a street in a strange city with tall, beautiful buildings. People in shiny jumpsuits walked by without even noticing her. The weirdest thing was that she could hear their thoughts because they weren't talking. She stood there for a while until suddenly a boy pointed his finger at her. Then she found herself back on the road by the field. Third story. I can't remember exactly where, but I read a story by a 40-year-old man. When he was 13 years old, his mother asked him to go to the neighboring village to visit his grandmother. He writes that he wasn't the most obedient boy, and then, surprisingly, he suddenly took off and ran. As he walked through the forest, he noticed a flock of crows suddenly appear in the sky. When he looked at the birds, they disappeared. From somewhere in front of the tree stump, a man in black appeared. The man told the boy that nothing on earth depends on man, and that the world is ruled by people like the man in black. Then, as if on the screen, the stranger showed the boy all his future life. The man also clarified in his story that his life is really going exactly according to the plan of the man in black. Fourth story. 1980, Pniwi. In the evening, my mother was on her way home from work. There was a short 5-minute walk left, and suddenly on the path, my mother saw a strange white mist like a cloud. My mother decided to walk through this cloud. From her story, she walked for a long time until she came across a deep river. There was nowhere to go. She had to swim. By the way, there's a river behind our house, but the water is up to our knees. Her mother came to the shore, and there was a lighted house ahead of her. Inside, she noticed German officers in uniform talking about something in German. I remind you, it was 1980. A guard with a machine gun was standing outside the house smoking. The light of a cigarette was visible. The mother quietly walked round the house so as not to be seen by them, and then she found herself on a hill from which she saw that she was 3 miles away from her town. When she turned around, she realized that she was actually standing at a ruin where there was no longer any house or Germans. She headed towards home again. Again the river, but it's our river, which is knee-deep. At home, she told us about this miracle. What it was is unknown. But by the way, 6 months later, my mother died after an electric shock. Fifth story. As a young family with a baby, my friends temporarily lived in an old house on the outskirts of Ocean City. One day, my friend's wife woke up to a noise outside the window, although it should be night and quiet. Looking out the window, she saw a gray morning, low clouds over the sea, and the sea was coming literally to the walls of their house. But what frightened her more was the presence of masted ships just off the shore, and the loud shouts of people, the commotion, the creaking of gear. The men appeared to be armed and nervous, unloading something. She woke her husband. He saw the same thing through the window and was shocked. Grabbing something sharp or heavy for defense and gathering his wits, he swung the door open to the street. However, it was a quiet night outside. Sixth story. A couple of years ago, I actually traveled to a parallel world. On this day, I was traveling by car from work on a route I rarely use. But this time, there was work being done on the road and a sign was pointing to a diversion. As it turned out, my new route was through a settlement. To be sure to get on the motorway correctly, I decided to ask passers-by about the road. I was surprised that I had never even suspected of the existence of this settlement before. A year later, hoping that the repair of the road is already finished, I drove along this route again. In my opinion, this settlement should have been visible from the road, as the forest belt separating the settlement from the road was still without leaves. However, when I looked in the direction of the forest belt, I did not see the settlement. This surprised me very much, and the next day I took the same route again, but this time I decided to drive through the village. But what was my surprise when at the place of the old village, I did not see even traces of the former dwellings. There were only old trees growing there, and since such strange things had happened to me many times, I concluded that I had been transported to a parallel universe for a while. And then I was returned to my world, where this village had never existed. The seventh story. When I was about 6 years old, one fine morning I ran to the bread shop. It was about 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. I had to go through a small park with densely planted trees. There stood a small building. I could read at that moment, so I could make out that the building said something about electricity. I woke up there next to the same building. It was already evening. I bought bread and went home. Strange, but nobody asked me anything. But since that day, I have always had the feeling that I am different, and something in my life has gone wrong. Throughout my life, there is such a feeling that my name is not mine and life is not mine. By the way, when I got older, I wondered how so many hours no one saw a 6-year-old girl lying on the path all day long. I mean, there were people going back and forth all the time. Sometimes I think it was something beyond human understanding or something wrong with my head. Eighth story. Again, a comment from a woman. Notice how few stories there are from men. Perhaps women are more susceptible to such cases, and so the story itself. In my life, there were several very strange cases. Here is one of them. Once when I was still young, coming from night work, I went to bed, and when I woke up, I saw my room as if it was upside down. I don't know how to explain it. Everything was the same, but upside down. When I tried to get up, I immediately felt my feet going into the abyss. There was no floor, only my bed was stable. I lay down and pressed myself into the bed out of fear. I don't remember how I fell asleep again. It never happened to me again in the future. Yes, there is something that we humans cannot understand and explain, but what happened to me looked very realistic. Ninth story. Funny, but upside-down rooms, as it turns out, are far from uncommon. The next story is about a similar situation. Again, written by a woman. I've never seen anything supernatural in my life, but still a few times something strange happened to me. I woke up in an upside-down room. I felt like I had a wall with a window instead of a floor under my feet. And I felt like if I tried to get up, I'd fall through the window. I believe it was my brain experiencing oxygen deprivation because I was in a high-altitude area at the time. The 10th story, this time written by a man. Personally, with me, happened irreversible incident in the autumn of 2019. I went for a walk. I went into a bar, sat there with a mate, drank a little. Returning home right outside the house, I get hit by a car. I remember that I woke up and without listening to the driver got up and went home. By the way, the driver wanted to help me, said something to me, panicked, but I didn't hear him, just got up and went home. However, already at home, my mother called me an ambulance, after which I was in a coma for 2 months. I also had an operation. When I woke up, I was examined again. Everything was fine and I was discharged from the hospital. Well, in my opinion, there is nothing unusual in this story. Most likely a person experienced pain shock or something like that. As you can see, friends, there are plenty of miracles in our world. Who liked the video, be sure to subscribe to the channel and write comments. See you in the next video.